Millions of women wrote to her personally. She answered every letter. She just wasn't real. Think about that for a moment. Not metaphorically unreal. Not unreal in the way that celebrities are unreal, removed and untouchable, living somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary afternoons. She was unreal in the most fundamental and complete sense possible. She did not have a body. She did not have a birthday. She did not have a kitchen of her own, though she presided with unfailing warmth and precision over the kitchens of millions. She had a name, and a face that changed with the decades, and a voice that came through the radio on quiet Tuesday mornings, and a signature, that flowing, looping, unmistakable signature that appeared on every letter, every cookbook, every box of cake mix, every coupon catalog, every piece of correspondence that arrived in the mailboxes of American women from coast to coast for the better part of a century. And yet she was, for an extraordinary number of those women, as real as the flour in the canister, the oven timer counting down, the smell of something good beginning to happen, as real as a neighbor who knows your name and is glad when things go well for you, as real as the voice you most need to hear on a morning when everything feels difficult and uncertain and too much. Her name was Betty Crocker, and if you grew up in mid-century America, you already know exactly who she was. You can see that red spoon logo without even trying. You can feel the weight of the cookbook, the red cover, the stiff binder rings, the glossy photographs of cakes with frosting that curled and swirled, just so, of roasts ringed by gleaming vegetables, of pies with lattice crusts that seem to exist in some achievable version of perfection. You can hear even now the sound of a warm female voice coming through the radio on a weekday morning, talking about pot roast or angel food cake, or the proper way to fold an egg white, her tone patient and unhurried, as though she had all the time in the world, and all of it was for you. She was everywhere, and she was no one, and somehow, impossibly, that made her even more powerful than if she had simply been a person. There was one letter she received, tens of thousands of times, the same letter in different handwriting, from different towns, across different decades, and her answer was always the same, always kind, always in that handwriting. We'll come back to that letter, because knowing what it asked, and knowing how Betty answered it, tells you everything about who she really was, and what the people behind her so profoundly understood about the women of America. But for now, hold it in mind. One letter, tens of thousands of times, and every answer, a small act of grace. Let's begin at the beginning, because the beginning is one of those wonderful, accidental, thoroughly American moments that seems almost too perfect to be true, and yet is entirely true. It was 1921. The Washburn Crosby Company, a Minneapolis flour milling enterprise that would in time become General Mills, ran a promotional contest. They asked consumers to complete a jigsaw picture of a gold medal flour bag and submit the entry for a prize. Thousands of responses arrived as hoped, but alongside them came something the company had not fully anticipated. Questions. Real questions. Earnest questions, written in pencil and in ink by real women who wanted to know things. How do I make my pie crust flaky? Why does my bread always come out dense? What am I doing wrong with the biscuits? The kind of questions that women carried in kitchens every day and rarely had a reliable place to take. The company had answers. They had home economists on staff, but they had a problem that was partly logistical and partly something far more subtle, something about human nature, about the way trust is built and received, about what it means to ask for help and to feel that the help you receive is meant for you specifically. A letter from a company is a transaction. A letter from a person is a conversation. And what these women were asking for, underneath the questions about flour ratios and yeast temperatures, was a conversation. So they invented a person. They held an internal contest among female employees to create a name, something warm, something friendly, something that felt like a neighbor and not a corporation. Betty emerged as the obvious choice, bright and approachable, a name that belonged to someone who would help you without making you feel foolish for having asked. And Crocker. That came from William Crocker, a recently retired director of the company who had served with genuine distinction and was warmly regarded by those who had known him. The two words together, Betty Crocker, had a rhythm, a rightness, as though the name had always existed somewhere and was only now being found. She was created not to sell flour, not directly. She was created because thousands of women were asking real questions that deserved real answers. And a company decided, and this decision carries weight even now, that the best way to answer those questions was through a relationship. Does that change anything about how you think of her? And then there is the detail that makes the whole thing suddenly, quietly extraordinary. They needed a signature, because a letter without a signature is an announcement. A letter with a signature is a relationship. The female employees of the Washburn Crosby Company were invited to write their names, just their names, on a slip of paper. From all those signatures, one was chosen, the handwriting of a secretary, a woman whose own name history has gently and somewhat regrettably set aside, was stylized and refined, and became the official signature of Betty Crocker. That one woman's flowing B, that careful C, the way her Y descended below the line with a particular graceful curve. These were reproduced, endlessly, and without variation, on millions of pieces of correspondence, on every cookbook, on every box of cake mix type, on every catalog page and every letter that landed in every mailbox across every decade. Her signature was real. It came from a real woman, a secretary who signed her name without imagining. How could she have imagined that her hand would sign 1,000,000 letters? That her penmanship would be the last thing a woman in Ohio saw before she folded a letter and held it in her lap and felt for a moment that someone was paying attention? We'll return to that signature. We'll return to it at the end, because it matters in a way that only becomes fully clear when you understand everything else. Now go to the radio. Because if you were of a certain age in a certain time, the radio is where you first heard her voice. It was 1924 when Betty Crocker's voice first came through the static of an AM radio signal. The Betty Crocker Cooking School of the Air, one of the first cooking programs in the history of radio broadcasting in America, began on a small regional network and grew over the years into something that millions of women structured their mornings around. Think about what the radio meant in 1924. In 1934, Tarsti, 1934. In 1944, it was not background noise. It was not something you half listened to while doing something else. It was the voice in the room. It was company. It was a connection to a world beyond the four walls of your kitchen, your house, your block, on a morning when those walls might feel very close indeed. And that voice, warm, calm, unhurried, feminine, with the particular quality of someone speaking directly to you and no one else, came through the speaker like a friend who had dropped by specifically to help you with dinner. The programs were scripted, of course, and delivered by actresses and home economists who inhabited the Betty Crocker persona. But in the mind of the woman at the kitchen counter, listening with one ear while the baby napped and the afternoon light came through the yellow curtains, In her mind, it was simply Betty speaking to her, knowing what she needed to hear. Can you remember the sound of it? The slight warmth of the speaker, the way a woman's voice carried something both intimate and authoritative, as though she knew things you needed to know and was glad you had finally asked. The programs covered everything: how to plan a week of meals on a reasonable budget, how to make a roast that would stretch into 3 dinners, how to bake a cake that rose evenly and came out of the pan without leaving half of itself behind, how to frost it so that when your mother-in-law came to dinner, you would feel a quiet, private, entirely legitimate pride. The advice was practical. It was specific. But it was something else as well. It was deeply and consistently kind. The tone of those radio programs understood something essential, that the women listening were not ignorant. They were not incompetent. They were simply learning, in a world that had limited patience for learning out loud. Betty never made you feel foolish. That was perhaps the most remarkable thing about her. If you grew up in a home where the radio played in the kitchen on weekday mornings, let yourself go back there for just a moment. The smell of coffee, the sound of something frying, the particular quality of morning light in a kitchen in 1952. Betty Crocker is on. She's talking about custard, or about the best way to use leftover chicken, or about a new cake recipe you might want to try this Sunday. And the woman in that kitchen, your mother perhaps, or your grandmother, or perhaps you yourself in a memory you haven't visited in years, is listening with a focused, private attention that means she trusts this voice completely. Not just the information in it, the voice itself, the personality behind it, the sense that this woman on the radio, whoever she was exactly, was on her side. That's what the radio gave her. Not merely recipes, not just techniques. Trust, though. The radio programs ran, in various forms, for decades. They shifted with the times, updated their content, changed their voices. But the name stayed the same. The warmth stayed the same. And the women kept listening, kept tuning in on Tuesday mornings to a voice that met them exactly where they were. During these same years, the letters were arriving. It is difficult, from a distance of a century, to fully appreciate the scale of the correspondence that poured through Betty Crocker's doors. We are talking about thousands of letters every single week at her peak. Thousands, written by hand, sealed in envelopes, mailed with 2-cent stamps, addressed simply to Betty Crocker, Minneapolis, Minnesota. And they arrived. They always arrived. Because the post office knew exactly where Betty Crocker lived. Because, in some real and unambiguous sense, everyone did. The letters were not casual. They were not form letters. They were the kind of writing you do late at night, when the children are finally in bed and the kitchen is quiet. When you have a moment to sit at the table with a pen and a piece of paper and attend to the thing that has been worrying you. They wrote about failed recipes and upcoming holidays, and the specific terror of cooking Christmas dinner for 15 people for the first time in a new house. They wrote about new marriages and the kitchen that had to be learned from scratch. They wrote about rationing during the war years, about making do, about the specific grief of not being able to give your family what you felt they deserved. Some wrote about sadness, carefully disguised as baking questions. Some wrote simply because they had read somewhere that Betty Crocker answered letters. And they needed, more than anything else, to know if that was true. It was true. Every letter was answered by a staff of trained home economists, women who knew food and kitchens, and, most importantly, who understood the question beneath the question. A letter asking about pie crust might really be asking, am I capable? Am I doing this right? Is this too hard for someone like me? And the answers, signed always with that flowing, familiar signature, addressed those deeper questions without ever naming them directly. The answers said, "Here is how to make your crust flakier. Here is the ratio. Here is the resting time. Here is what to do when the dough tears." And underneath all of that precise and practical guidance, the message was always the same. You can do this. You are not alone. You are doing beautifully. Did you ever write to Betty? Or did your mother keep one of her letters in a kitchen drawer, tucked between a recipe card and an old grocery list? Somewhere you found it years later and didn't quite know what to do with the feeling it gave you. If a letter did arrive, addressed to you using your name, responding to exactly what you had asked, you might remember the particular sensation of holding. It felt personal. It felt like it had been written for you, even though the signature at the bottom belonged to a woman who had never lived, and the hand that wrote it belonged to someone working at a desk in Minneapolis who would never know your name. None of that diminished what the letter was. None of it diminished what it gave you. The warmth was real. The care was real. The information was tested and true. And that signature, that steady, looping promise, told you that you had been heard. This is, if you think about it carefully, one of the most sophisticated achievements in the history of American consumer culture. Care, delivered at enormous scale, that felt entirely personal. Betty Crocker understood, before the word existed, before anyone had a framework for this kind of thinking, the psychology of being known, of being answered, of feeling that the reply to your question had been written for you and only you, even when 1,000 other women had asked the same thing that same week. The home economists who wrote those answers were remarkable. They were educated, skilled, professionally trained in a field that the world around them was inclined to dismiss as merely domestic, which it was, of course, and which was precisely why it deserved the level of expertise they brought to it. They tested recipes. They researched food science. They understood the chemistry of baking before most home cooks had any reason to think in those terms. They translated complex technique into language that was welcoming and clear and stripped of any condescension. And they did it all under a name that was not theirs. Every answer they wrote, every recipe they perfected, every technique they explained, it went out into the world as Betty's, not theirs. There is something in that to sit with, something that might feel, on first consideration, like loss or erasure. But there is another way to understand it. What those women built together through that shared name was something larger than any of them could have been alone. The fiction of Betty Crocker was the vessel that held the collective wisdom of hundreds of real women with real expertise and made it available to millions more. That is not diminishment. That is, in its quiet and unassuming way, a kind of miracle. Now, let us talk about her face. Because Betty Crocker had a face. Several of them, in fact, and that too is a story worth knowing. Her first portrait was commissioned in 1936, painted in a style that was simultaneously warm and competent. The face of a woman you would trust immediately. Dark hair, kind eyes, a measured smile that communicated patience and confidence in equal measure. She looked like the best version of the woman you hoped to be. Not glamorous, not intimidating, but capable, settled. The kind of woman who walked into a kitchen problem and walked out with a solution, who never flustered and never made you feel that you should have known better. She appeared on the packaging, in the cookbooks, on the calendars sent out with the coupon catalogs. And then, here's the detail that speaks so eloquently to the intelligence behind her. She changed. Every decade or so, her portrait was quietly, carefully repainted. The 1936 Betty gave way to a 1955 Betty, softer and more contemporary. The 1965 Betty reflected the world of the mid-60s in the most subtle of ways. A slightly different hairstyle, a slightly different quality of light. Each new portrait was crafted by artists who understood that Betty Crocker had to remain of her time without losing her essential self. She had to look like someone you might actually encounter in the world, at a church social or a PTA meeting, or standing in line at the grocery store, while also retaining something that was unchangeable and immediately recognizable as her. The kind eyes stayed. The patient, ready smile stayed. The sense that she was looking at you with complete and unhurried attention, ready to help you with whatever had gone wrong, that stayed across every decade, across every new portrait. She adapted. She never disappeared. She never became distant or cold or unreachable. She kept coming back in the shape of each new era, still that same woman underneath. You probably stood in a grocery aisle once and reached for her cookbook before you had fully decided to. Something in the red cover, something in those eyes on the back, made you trust it before you'd read a word. That trust was not manufactured from nothing. It was built over decades by hundreds of women answering thousands of letters, by home economists testing recipes until they were reliable for any kitchen with any oven, by a company that made a decision early and with real consequence. In 1941, the Betty Crocker kitchens opened in Minneapolis, and they were, this is the essential thing, real, physical rooms, well-equipped, professionally staffed, rigorously maintained. Every recipe that would ever appear under Betty Crocker's name was made in those kitchens first. Not once, but many times. It was made wrong. To understand why it was wrong, it was adjusted. It was made again. The temperature was changed. The ratio was shifted. The resting time was extended. The folding technique was reconsidered until the recipe worked every time in any kitchen for any woman, regardless of how much experience she brought to it. The commitment was total. You will not be failed. If you follow these instructions, it will work. Those kitchens smelled of baking. That seems almost too simple to mention, but let yourself feel it for a moment. A place of work, a professional testing facility, and underneath all the testing and adjusting and recording of results, the warm, constant, enveloping smell of bread and cake and pie, the smell of home, the smell of something good coming. The work was serious, and the space smelled of sweetness, and both of those things were entirely true at once. The Betty Crocker kitchens are still operating today. The same building, the same purpose. Decade after decade of recipes tested, adjusted, perfected, and sent out into the world under that familiar signature. When you made a Betty Crocker recipe, and it came out right, and it came out right so consistently that you may have forgotten to notice, it was because someone in Minneapolis had made it wrong many times, until they understood with precision how to make it right. Your success in the kitchen was, in a very direct sense, their work, their care and expertise, folded quietly into a recipe card and handed to you through the pages of a book with a red cover. Which brings us to the cookbook. Right. The first edition, published in 1950. Red cover. Binder format. A specific deliberate, entirely practical choice, because the binder format meant you could open it flat on the counter without it closing on you. It was designed to be used, not admired on a shelf, not treated as something precious and fragile, used actively and repeatedly in an actual kitchen by an actual woman with flour on her hands and something in the oven. The 1950 cookbook was an immediate bestseller, one of the most successful cookbook launches in American publishing history. They are new bottles on beer. Then I ate dairy out free. And it is not difficult to understand why. It was comprehensive, and it was approachable. It had photographs. Gorgeous, full-color, aspirational photographs of finished dishes in their complete and beautiful form. Cakes frosted in perfect swirling mounds, roasts ringed by roasted vegetables, pies with golden lattice crusts. But alongside those photographs was language that was completely unintimidating, that spoke to the woman who had never made a cream sauce before, who wasn't sure she understood the difference between simmering and boiling, who just wanted to make something good for dinner and feel proud of it at the end. If you had a copy, if you still have a copy, you know the feel of it in your hand, the slight give of the binder cover, the sound the rings make when you press them open, though you almost never need to rearrange anything, the way certain pages fall open automatically, because you have used them so many times that the book has learned the shape of your cooking life. The yellow cake page, the chocolate chip cookie page, the pot roast page that has a small stain on it from some long ago dinner and has been there ever since. A record of a meal that fed people you love. Do you remember the first time you made a cake from her cookbook or from one of her mixes and it came out exactly right? That feeling, that particular, specific, private feeling of opening the oven door and finding that the cake has risen evenly, that the color is exactly the golden brown the recipe promised, that the smell filling the kitchen is precisely what you had hoped for. You were perhaps 22 or 25. It was for a birthday, or a Sunday dinner, or simply for a Tuesday because you wanted to make something. The cookbook was open on the counter, that red cover slightly splattered by now. When you frosted it, when you swirled the frosting in careful circles, and it looked, against all probability, like the photograph, when someone tasted it and closed their eyes for just a second. That was Betty Crocker, working through your hands, through the recipe she had tested until it could not fail you. The cake mixes came in the early 1950s, and they brought with them one of the quietest and most human stories in the history of American food. The early mixes were a technological achievement. Add water. Dot cream. Stir. Dot. Bake 8. The cakes they produced were perfectly good. They rose. They tasted right. They came out of the pan cleanly. And yet, somewhat bewilderingly, women didn't embrace them. They tried them and set them aside. The feedback was consistent enough and specific enough that someone with a clear eye and a genuine desire to understand had to take it seriously. What emerged from listening was this: the women didn't feel right about the mixes. Not because the cakes were bad, but because the making of them felt hollow, too easy. There was no room in the process for the maker to leave any part of herself behind. Cake belonged to the factory. It didn't belong to the kitchen. And for a woman whose daily expression of care and skill was routed largely through what she fed her family, a cake that required nothing of her was not a gift. It was, in a very real sense, a subtraction. The solution, the famous, elegant, psychologically astute solution was to remove the powdered egg from the mix, to require the baker to add a fresh egg, one egg, cracked by her hand, from her own refrigerator. That single gesture transformed the experience entirely. She had contributed something. She had participated in the making. The egg she added was, in some way that matters even if it defies precise articulation, the love she put in. The cake was hers. Sales reversed immediately, and the lesson was not lost. Betty Crocker's world was a world that took seriously the interior life of the women it served. That understood cooking was never only about food. That knew the women stirring the batter were also simultaneously expressing something. Care, creativity, identity, love, that could not be reduced to efficiency without being lost entirely. There was one letter Betty received tens of thousands of times. Remember, we said we would come back to it. In different handwriting, from different corners of the country, across 4 decades, the letter said essentially the same thing. Something has gone wrong. My cake falls in the center. My bread won't rise. My pie crust is tough, or too crumbly, or won't hold together. Tell me what I'm doing wrong. Tell me how to fix it. But underneath those specific questions, underneath the flour ratios and the yeast temperatures and the questions about butter versus shortening, the letter was always asking something else. It was asking, am I capable? Is this too hard for someone like me? Is there something wrong with me, or with my kitchen, or with the way I approach this? And in the silence beneath even that question, it was asking something quieter still. Is anyone out there? Is anyone paying attention? Betty's answer was always yes. Yes, here is how to fix the crust. Yes, here is why the cake fell. Yes, here's the technique and the ratio, and the temperature and the resting time. Specific and clear and entirely practical. And beneath the practical answer, always, the underlying message that the answer itself carried: you are not failing. You are learning. This is fixable. You can do this. I'm paying attention. Every answer was signed with that signature. That signature that came from one real woman's hand and became the most reproduced piece of handwriting in American history. Think about the secretary in Minneapolis who signed her name that day, who had no way of knowing what she was handing over. Her penmanship, her particular B, her careful C, the way her signature moved across the page, was the last thing a woman in Nebraska saw before she folded a letter and sat quietly at her kitchen table for a moment, feeling less alone than she had a few minutes before. The signature is still there today. On the cookbooks, on the website, on the packaging. Still the same looping, curling, unmistakable handwriting. Still that same hand. Still that same promise. I'm here. I heard you. Here is what you needed to know. The coupon catalog. The Betty Crocker Points Program. For millions of families, this was as central to Betty's world as any recipe or radio show. A ritual accumulated quietly over months and years in kitchen drawers across America. The points came from the packaging. Box tops from cake mix boxes, labels from gold medal flour bags, panels from frosting cans. You saved them. You clipped them carefully and kept them in an envelope tucked inside the cookbook, or in a special tin that lived in a kitchen drawer and existed for no other purpose. And when you had saved enough, when the accumulated points from months of cooking and baking and feeding your family had added up to the magic number, you consulted the catalog. The catalog, that thin, slightly pulpy paper, the pages that smelled of fresh ink and possibility, the black and white photographs of Oneida silverware, of serving dishes, of mixing bowls and kitchen tools, the careful counting at the kitchen table. Do we have enough yet for the serving spoon? Or should we wait another month and save for the place setting? The decision made. The order form filled out in your neatest handwriting. The envelope sealed and mailed. The waiting, which was its own kind of pleasure. The arrival, finally, of a package that contained something real and solid and honestly earned. Something you had paid for, not with money, but with the daily cumulative labor of feeding your family well. Do you still have any of the Betty Crocker flatware or a piece of that coupon catalog life tucked away somewhere in a drawer or a cabinet? Maybe in a drawer that doesn't get opened very often. A serving spoon with a particular weight, a specific curve to the handle. The kind of weight that feels honest and substantial and slightly formal. Or a set of forks with a pattern you would recognize immediately. The kind of silverware that feels like your mother's kitchen, that carries the specific gravity of a life spent feeding people. It was real. You earned it. Betty gave it to you. Or rather, the idea of Betty, expressed through gold metal flour bags and cake mix boxes, and the careful ritual of saving and counting and ordering, gave it to you, as payment, in a sense, for everything you put into your kitchen over all those years. As the decades moved forward, through the war years, through the astonishing post-war boom, through the years when television arrived and changed the rhythm of domestic life, through the early stirrings of a culture that was beginning, cautiously and then loudly, to question what domestic life meant for women, Betty Crocker remained. She adapted. Her face changed. Her cookbooks were updated. Her products evolved. But she remained, and the relationship she had built with the women who trusted her remained something unusual in American commercial culture. Intimate, consistent, and genuinely reciprocal. During the war years in particular, her presence carried a different kind of weight. The radio programs addressed the specific pressures of rationing, how to feed a family on reduced amounts of meat and sugar, how to make do with what was available, how to maintain the rituals of home cooking when the ingredients were scarce and anxiety was a constant presence in every room of the house. The voice on the radio was steady. The recipes in the cookbook were adapted. The letters were answered as they had always been answered, with patience and precision, and the underlying assurance that you were doing fine, that this was hard for everyone, that the ingenuity you were bringing to your kitchen was something to be proud of. Those years mattered. The trust that Betty Crocker had built in the ordinary years was tested in the harder ones, and it held, because it was built on something real, on actual expertise, actual care, actual reliability. It did not collapse under pressure. If anything, it deepened. The women who had written to her in 1938 about a problem with their pie crust wrote to her again in 1943 about how to stretch a pound of ground beef to feed 5 people. And Betty answered. She always answered. By the mid-1940s, Betty Crocker had become something beyond a brand. She was a cultural institution of a particular and quietly astonishing kind. A 1945 survey ranked her as the second most recognized woman in America, behind Eleanor Roosevelt and ahead of everyone else. The First Lady of the United States, and then Betty Crocker, a fictional woman, a name and a signature, and a painted face, and a voice on the radio, ranked among the most real and most significant presences in American life. Not because of celebrity, not because of power, but because she was there, in the kitchen, every day. Because she answered your letters. Because she told you your cake would be fine. And it was. There is a kind of honor in that. If you think about it clearly, the women of America chose to trust her not because they were deceived, but because she was trustworthy, because she delivered, because every promise her recipe made was kept, and every question she answered was answered well, and every letter that arrived at a kitchen table in a small town or a big city carried something genuine inside it. Even beneath the fiction of the name, she never aged, she never judged, she just helped. The cookbooks kept coming after the landmark 1950 edition. Updated and expanded volumes, specialized collections, books devoted to baking and to outdoor cooking and to the slower, more deliberate pleasures of Sunday dinners. Each one tested in the Minneapolis kitchens. Each one signed with that signature. Each one assuming, always, that the reader was capable and curious and deserving of good, clear, reliable information. The red cover remained that particular, specific shade of red, the red of warmth and kitchens, and the spoon logo that appeared on every package. A color that became so completely associated with her that you could see it from the end of a grocery aisle and know, without reading a single word, that it was Betty's. Let us talk about frosting for a moment, because the frosting deserves its own small acknowledgement. There is a specific and irreplaceable memory associated with Betty Crocker frosting. Not the frosting on the cake, exactly, but the frosting that remained in the mixing bowl when the cake had been finished, the frosting on the beaters, on the spatula, on the inside of the bowl that someone had to deal with, and that someone was usually a child. If you were that child, you know exactly what we're talking about. The sweetness of it, the particular richness of chocolate frosting that was thick and dark and slightly more complex than simple sweet. The spoon offered to you by your mother or your grandmother. The way you held the beater in both hands and licked it clean. The red Betty Crocker box on the counter behind her. That familiar signature right there at eye level, while you stood in the kitchen, eating frosting from a spoon. In no doubt whatsoever that life at this moment was exactly as good as it needed to be. That memory is real. It belongs to you. Betty Crocker made it possible. Or rather, the hundreds of real women behind her name in the Minneapolis kitchens, testing the frosting recipe until it was exactly right, made it possible. Their work, your spoon, your mother's kitchen, a chain of care connecting a professional testing facility to the most ordinary and warm afternoon of childhood. The home economists who staffed those kitchens and answered those letters and scripted those radio programs deserve more than a footnote in this story. They were the actual people behind the fiction, brilliant, skilled, professionally serious women who devoted their working lives to a name that was not there. Some of them spent decades there, their entire professional identities folded into Betty Crocker's, their expertise flowing out into the world through a signature that carried no trace of who they actually were. There is generosity in that, and perhaps resignation, and perhaps the particular pragmatism of women who understood the world they were working in and chose to do excellent work within its constraints rather than to fight against them. Whatever drove them, the result was extraordinary. Their collective wisdom, their daily dedication, their genuine care for the women sending in those letters, all of it was real. All of it was given freely, and none of it was wasted. It reached its audience. The cakes rose. The pies flaked. The bread browned perfectly on a Sunday morning. The families were fed, and the women who fed them felt, because of Betty, a little less alone in the doing of it. Here's something worth sitting with, quietly, near the end. The kitchen, in mid-century America, was where a woman spent a significant portion of her waking life. It was her domain in a way that was both an honor and a constraint. It belonged to her, and she belonged to it, and the world beyond its walls was, too often, not particularly interested in what she was learning there. The knowledge required to run a kitchen well, the timing, the chemistry, the economy, the intuition that told you when the roast was done without looking at a thermometer, the judgment that came from years of feeding people and knowing what they needed. None of this was considered knowledge in any formal sense. It was just what women did. Betty Crocker never accepted that framing. Misu, never, not once, in any letter or radio program or cookbook or recipe card, the entire apparatus she represented. The kitchens, the testing, the home economists, the careful recipe writing, the patient letter answering, the precise and unpatronizing tone, insisted, quietly and consistently, and over decades, that what women were doing in their kitchens was worth taking seriously, worth researching, worth perfecting, worth communicating about with the same care and precision that any other technical field deserved. The recipes were tested because cooking deserved to be taken seriously. The letters were answered because the questions deserved serious answers. The cookbooks were designed for use because the work they served was real work. This is perhaps the deepest thing Betty Crocker ever said, and she said it without words, through action, through the daily work of answering every letter, testing every recipe, perfecting every cake mix, painting a face with kind eyes, and making sure it looked like a woman who respected you. She said, "What you do in your kitchen matters. You matter. And here is everything I know, given freely, to help you do it well." We've been circling a question from the beginning, haven't we? Gently, without quite naming it. She wasn't real. She was a name chosen for its warmth and a signature, borrowed from a secretary's hand, and a face painted and repainted to reflect the changing image of what an American woman should look like. She was a voice performed by actresses. She was the sum of hundreds of real women, real expertise, real care, given freely and anonymously under a name that belonged to all of them, and none of them. And yet, she was real in the ways that seem, upon reflection, to be the ones that matter most. She was real in her reliability, real in her care, real in her consistent and genuine respect for the women she served, real in every letter answered, every recipe tested, every catalog printed, every point redeemed for a serving spoon that has sat in a kitchen drawer for 40 years. She was real in the radio voice that kept you company on a lonely Tuesday, real in the cookbook that opens to the right page without prompting, real in the signature that arrived on a letter when you were 25 and didn't know how to make a pie crust and needed, more than a recipe, to feel that someone was paying attention. She was real in the way that only truly generous things can be real, entirely in the service of someone else's need. Did it matter that she wasn't real? If the comfort was real, and the answers were true, and the cake came out right every time, let's go back to the kitchen, the one you remember most clearly, the one that belongs to a specific time and a specific quality of light, late afternoon or weekend morning, or the particular hush of a weekday when everyone else was elsewhere. And the kitchen was yours. The smell of something baking, the radio's quiet warmth, the red cookbook open on the counter, its spine worn from years of use, a few pages stained with the evidence of specific meals you no longer quite remember, the Betty Crocker signature just visible on the cover, that looping, curling, unmistakable promise. You are in a kitchen that knew her, that trusted her, that kept her, in some form, a recipe card in her handwriting, a piece of flatware, a stain on a page, a memory of frosting on a spoon, long after the radio programs ended and the world moved on. Maybe you still have a piece of that flatware in a drawer. Pick it up if you can. Feel the weight of it. Solid and simple, and a little heavier than modern silverware. The kind of weight that feels honest. Something in your hands, when you hold it, might remember the catalog, the counting of points, the decision at the kitchen table about what to order this time. Something might remember the kitchen those years built, and the woman who helped build it, and the signature that meant she had heard you. She is still there, in some form, still answering. Not by hand, not with that signature on a personal reply, but in the accumulated knowledge of decades of testing and caring and paying attention, in the recipes that still work reliably every time, in the cookbooks that still open flat on the counter, in the way they were always designed. She is in every technique she taught, and every question she answered, and every cake that rose exactly as she promised it would. She never aged. She changed her face to stay close to you, to remain someone you could recognize as belonging to your time. But she never grew cold or distant or too busy to answer. She kept being there, in the way of things that were built to last, because they were built on something real underneath the fiction. We began with a statement. We said that millions of women wrote to her personally, that she answered every letter, and that she just wasn't real. And perhaps that statement means something different now than it did at the beginning, because we've spent this time in her kitchen, in the kitchen she presided over without a body, without a heartbeat, without a single actual meal of her own. And what we found there was not a hoax, not a manipulation, not a hollow corporate fiction dressed up to look like friendship. What we found was something that a company built and a community of real women sustained to care for the women of America. Something that held the knowledge and the patience and the genuine concern that those women deserved and often could not find elsewhere. Something that said, in every letter, in every radio program, in every cookbook page, and every carefully counted point, you are doing important work. Here's help. Here's the answer. Here's the signature that tells you the answer is true, and that you are not alone. She was never real. She was always real. The most real thing about her was the relationship. The tens of millions of quiet, private, intimate relationships between a name on a page and a woman in a kitchen who needed what that name could give. Maybe you still have the cookbook. Maybe it's on a shelf in the kitchen, or in a cabinet, or in a cardboard box you haven't opened since you moved. Maybe it falls open to the yellow cake page, or the pot roast page, or the lemon meringue page that you attempted once and never quite perfected, but kept trying. Maybe it has your mother's handwriting in the margins, a note about adding more vanilla, a reminder about watching the temperature, a small and private correction that turned Betty's recipe into your family's recipe. That is your hand in her book. That is the collaboration she always intended. Her knowledge, your kitchen, your judgment, your variation, your stain on the page. She gave you the foundation, and you built something on it that was entirely yours. That was always the point. She never wanted the credit. She only ever wanted the cake to come out right. And at the end, perhaps this, she was a decision. Not a person, not a ghost, not a marketing trick. A decision made by a company in 1921 to be consistently kind to the women who needed kindness, to answer every letter, to test every recipe, to take seriously the work being done in kitchens across America, work the world largely dismissed as invisible, to repaint the face when the world changed, and keep the eyes kind through every portrait, and keep the kitchens running, and keep the signature on the books, decade after decade, because the women who had trusted her were still there, still cooking, still asking, still deserving of an answer. It was a commercial decision, yes. It was a business, yes. But the decision to care well, to do the work of caring with real effort and real expertise and real consistency, year after year, for 100 years, for 100 years, that decision has consequences that outlast its origins and outgrow their reason. The consequences were in millions of kitchens, in the cakes that rose, and the pies that were eaten, and the letters kept in drawers for years because they said something that needed to be said. The consequences are in memory, right now, of a red cookbook lying open on a counter, of a signature you would know anywhere in the world, of a voice through a radio that told you what to do, and underneath the recipe told you that you were capable of doing it. She wasn't real. And she changed your life in the small, daily, irreplaceable ways that a kitchen and a meal and a trusted voice can change a life. She was a fiction that told the truth, a ghost that was present, an absence in the shape of a woman, and in that shape, something to hold. The signature is still there, on the cookbooks and the boxes and the website. That looping, curling, unmistakable handwriting from one woman's hand on one afternoon in Minneapolis, when she signed her name and gave it, unknowingly, to an idea larger than anything she could have imagined. An idea that went out into the world and stayed there. That answered letters and baked cakes, and kept company through lonely Tuesdays, and kept its eyes kind through every painted decade. She never went away. She never stopped answering. She just, quietly, patiently, in the way of things that were made to last, kept being there. In the kitchen, in the letter, in the cookbook fallen open to the right page, in the taste of frosting on a spoon offered by your mother, in a kitchen that smelled of cake and coffee, and the particular warmth of an afternoon that you have never entirely left. Betty Crocker, the woman who never existed, and who, in the only way that ever truly mattered, was always completely real.